Each year, military forces conducting operations in remote jungle territories report encounters with phenomena that defy conventional tactical assessment and challenge every established protocol in the field manual. It happens with such disturbing frequency that the Pentagon's Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program has quietly allocated over $40 million annually to investigate unexplained contact incidents involving non-human entities in combat zones, though these expenditures remain carefully buried within classified black budget line items that most congressmen will never see. The Vietnam War saw more than 2.7 million American service members deployed to the dense, unforgiving jungles of Southeast Asia between 1965 and 1973, where the combination of guerrilla warfare, psychological warfare tactics, and the suffocating environment created conditions ripe for encounters that military leadership would spend decades attempting to erase from official records. For a brief period during the final months of 1971, one Marine Reconnaissance Unit operating deep in the A Shau Valley would document something so methodically, predatory, and impossibly intelligent that it forced MACV headquarters to implement an entirely new classification, protocol specifically designed to contain any mention of the incidents. But what exactly was the entity that systematically hunted Force Recon Marines through 37 square kilometers of triple canopy jungle? And why did the Department of Defense order the immediate psychiatric discharge and permanent separation of every single survivor before they could compare their testimonies with one another? The A Shau Valley stretches approximately 45 kilometers along the Laotian border in what was then known as Thieu Thanh Province, a corridor of mountainous terrain so strategically vital and so viciously contested that it earned the nickname the Valley of Death among American forces who operated there. The region encompasses roughly 520 square kilometers of triple canopy jungle where sunlight rarely penetrates below the uppermost layer of vegetation, creating a perpetual twilight at ground level even during midday hours, with temperatures that could swing from suffocating 38 degrees Celsius heat to bone-chilling monsoon rains within hours. The valley floor sits between 800 and 1,000 meters of elevation, surrounded by peaks that tower another 1,000 meters above, creating a natural amphitheater where sound behaves unpredictably, echoing off ridge lines in ways that make determining the direction of enemy fire nearly impossible. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this remote stretch of wilderness, largely unexplored by Western forces until the mid-1960s, had been home to isolated Montagnard tribes for thousands of years, indigenous peoples who possessed extensive oral histories about things that moved through the deepest parts of the jungle, things that walked upright like men but were decidedly not human. French colonial military records from the First Indochina War, declassified only in 1994 and translated from archives in Paris, contain multiple references to encounters with what French Foreign Legion troops stationed in the Central Highlands between 1946 and 1954 called L'Homme Sauvage de la Montagne, the Wild Man of the Mountains. One particularly detailed account, filed by Capitaine Henry Bouchard of the 2nd Foreign Parachute Battalion in August 1953, describes his platoon's discovery of a remote Montagnard village that had been completely abandoned overnight, with cooking fires still smoldering and food left uneaten, as if the entire population of 63 people had simply vanished mid-meal. The village elder's hut contained crude pictographs painted in what appeared to be a mixture of ash and animal blood, depicting massive bipedal figures that the accompanying Montagnard scouts refused to discuss, though one interpreter eventually explained that the drawings represented Gui Ring, forest people who stood 3 meters tall and whose territorial boundaries were marked by arrangements of twisted tree branches that no tribesman would dare cross. Bouchard's report notes that his men discovered similar branch formations less than 200 meters from the abandoned village, arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately designed to create an impassable barrier, and that the jungle beyond these markers fell completely silent, devoid of even insect sounds, as if every living creature had fled from something that claimed that territory as its own. American forces would encounter their own versions of these phenomena throughout the war, though official documentation remains frustratingly fragmented and heavily redacted even today. A declassified incident report from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, dated November 14, 1967, describes a listening post in Kon Tum province that radioed in frantic reports of something massive moving through their perimeter at 0237 hours, something that allegedly lifted there claymore mines from the ground and carefully placed them aside before approaching the position. The report states that both soldiers manning the listening post fired an entire magazine, each from their M16 rifles, at what specialist Thomas Hendricks described in his after-action statement as a figure easily 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair, moving with intelligence and purpose through our position. When a relief force reached the listening post at first light, they found both soldiers physically unharmed, but in a state of profound psychological distress. And more disturbing, they discovered that every piece of C-ration food in the position had been opened and consumed. Yet the soldiers' weapons, ammunition, and tactical equipment remained untouched and carefully arranged in a neat line, as if whatever had visited them understood the difference between sustenance and instruments of violence. Similar encounters were reported by LRRP teams operating in the A Shau Valley throughout 1969 and 1970, always following the same pattern. Massive bipedal figures, seemingly interested in food rather than conflict, displaying a level of intelligence that suggested they understood military operations and knew exactly which items in a soldier's kit were dangerous and which were not. October 23, 1971, 1340 hours, and Staff Sergeant Vincent Kowalski Kalsine Sledge was leading his 6-man reconnaissance team through a particularly dense section of jungle, approximately 8 clicks southwest of Fire Support Base Ripgird, which had been abandoned and destroyed 4 months earlier during one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Kowalski, a veteran of 2 tours with Force Recon who had earned his nickname after single-handedly holding a position against a company-sized NVA assault using only his entrenching tool after his rifle jammed, had trained his team to move through the jungle like shadows, each man maintaining 15-meter intervals and communicating only through hand signals to avoid detection. His team consisted of Corporal James "Doc" Martinez, the unit medic whose steady hands had saved more lives than anyone could count; Lance Corporal Robert Chun, a Chinese-American kid from San Francisco who could read terrain better than any map; Private First Class Deshaun Williams, the radio man whose Mississippi drawl could somehow cut through even the worst static; Lance Corporal Anthony Russo, pointman and the youngest of the group at 19; and Corporal Michael Bear Thompson, their rear security, who got his nickname not from his size, but from his uncanny ability to sense danger before it materialized. The air hung thick with moisture that afternoon, temperature hovering around 36 degrees Celsius, and the jungle canopy above them dripped with condensation that soaked through their uniforms within minutes of beginning their patrol. But it was Russo who first noticed that something felt fundamentally wrong about this particular stretch of jungle, stopping mid-step and raising his fist in the signal for immediate halt, because the normal symphony of jungle sounds, the constant buzz of insects and distant calls of birds and monkeys, had cut off as abruptly as if someone had flipped a switch. Kowalski moved forward to Russo's position, placing each foot with deliberate care to avoid snapping even the smallest twig, and that's when he saw what had stopped his pointman dead in his tracks. A series of branches, each roughly as thick as a man's wrist, had been twisted and broken in a pattern that formed what could only be described as a barrier across their intended path, the wood still fresh enough that sap was bleeding from the breaks, and the branches had been woven together with such precision that it seemed impossible any human could have accomplished it without power tools. The arrangement stood approximately 2.5 meters high and extended at least 20 meters in both directions, disappearing into the dense undergrowth. And what made Kowalski's skin crawl was the realization that this hadn't been here when Division Intelligence had done aerial reconnaissance of this sector just 72 hours earlier, meaning something had constructed this elaborate barrier in the middle of one of the most hostile combat zones in Vietnam in less than 3 days. Williams moved up to photograph the structure for the intelligence report they would file, but his Pentax camera began behaving erratically the moment he raised it, the light meter jumping from extreme overexposure to complete darkness despite the consistent twilight of the jungle canopy, and his wristwatch, a reliable Timex that had survived 11 months in country, had stopped at exactly 13:47 hours, the second-hand frozen mid-sweep. Doc Martinez noticed his compass spinning slowly in circles, unable to find magnetic north, and when Chun checked his own compass and watch, he discovered identical failures. Both pieces of equipment that had functioned perfectly less than 5 minutes earlier suddenly rendered useless, as if something in this immediate area was generating an electromagnetic field strong enough to interfere with basic mechanical devices. Then came the smell, an overwhelming mixture of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else, something organic and musky that none of them could quite identify, but that triggered an instinctive revulsion. Deep in their hindbrains, the kind of smell that made every man in the team suddenly aware that they were in the presence of a predator. And Russo, whose hands never shook no matter how hot the contact, found his M16 trembling slightly as his body flooded with adrenaline his conscious mind hadn't yet authorized. Bear Thompson was maintaining rear security approximately 15 meters behind the main element when Williams heard the sound over the radio, a brief, strangled transmission that consisted of 3 words: contact rear. Something before the channel dissolved into static, so violent it sounded like the radio itself was screaming. Kowalski immediately executed their rehearsed reaction drill, half the team moving back toward Thompson as last known position, while the other half established a hasty defensive perimeter. But when they reached the spot where their rear security should have been, they found only his rifle lying on the ground, the sling cleanly severed, as if cut with a razor rather than torn or broken, and his rucksack sitting upright and unopened exactly where he would have placed it during a rest halt. Everything arranged with almost ceremonial precision. The jungle floor showed clear evidence of a massive struggle, vegetation crushed in a radius of at least 6 meters. But the disturbing detail that made Doc Martinez actually take a step backward was the complete absence of blood. No arterial spray, no drag marks, no indication that Thompson had been wounded, despite clear signs that something had grabbed him with enough force to snap a reinforced nylon strap designed to hold 50 pounds of gear. They found his boot prints where he had been standing, clear impressions in the soft jungle soil, and they found something else. A second set of prints, if they could even be called that, impressions in the mud that measured at least 40 centimeters long and 20 centimeters wide at the ball of the foot, with clear impressions of 5 toes. But the depth of the impressions suggested whatever made them weighed substantially more than any human could possibly weigh, easily over 200 kilograms based on the compression of the soil. Russo was examining these tracks when he noticed the trees approximately 10 meters ahead, massive hardwoods with trunks at least 1 meter in diameter, and on the bark, at a height of roughly 3 meters above ground level, there were fresh scratch marks, 4 parallel gouges that had torn through the outer bark and into the lighter wood beneath. And when Chun used his rifle sling to measure the span between the marks, he found they matched exactly the spacing of fingers on a human hand, except no human could reach 3 meters high without climbing, and the bark around these marks showed no scuff marks or disturbance from boots or hands scrambling for purchase. Kowalski immediately attempted to establish communication with their firebase, following standard protocol for missing personnel in hostile territory. But Williams reported that every frequency on his PRC-77 radio was producing nothing but ear-splitting static, the kind of white noise interference that shouldn't be possible in this terrain without active jamming equipment. And Division had briefed them specifically that NVA forces in this sector lacked that level of sophisticated electronic warfare capability. The team established a hasty perimeter at tight circle, each man facing outward with rifles at the ready, while Kowalski tried to formulate a rational tactical assessment of their situation. They were 8 clicks from the nearest friendly position. They had lost one man to an unknown hostile force that left no blood trail. Their communications were completely compromised, and their navigation equipment had failed simultaneously, in a manner that suggested either a massive equipment malfunction or something generating localized electromagnetic interference powerful enough to affect multiple devices at once. Doc Martinez, who had completed 2 years of pre-med at UCLA before enlisting, began examining the physical evidence with the methodical precision of someone trained in scientific observation, documenting the track measurements in his notebook, sketching the pattern of the disturbed vegetation, and noting that the temperature in their immediate vicinity had dropped by what he estimated was at least 5 degrees Celsius, despite no change in cloud cover or wind conditions. Chun, meanwhile, discovered something that made the rational explanation even more elusive. A section of torn camouflage fabric, approximately 10 centimeters square, hanging from a thorn bush at chest height, fabric that matched Thompson's uniform exactly, but the edges of the tear showed no fraying or distress, instead appearing to have been cut with surgical precision. And more disturbing, the fabric was completely dry despite the humidity that kept everything in the jungle perpetually damp, as if whatever had torn it from Thompson's uniform had generated enough heat to instantly evaporate any moisture. Williams, desperate to find some explanation that fit within the framework of conventional military threats, began sorting through his rucksack for the area intelligence packet they had been issued before the patrol, and tucked between the topographical maps and aerial photographs, he found a single page that none of them remembered seeing during their pre-mission briefing, a document marked Confidential Historical Background, A Shau Valley Indigenous Beliefs. That appeared to be a translation of interviews conducted with Montagnard scouts by a Special Forces team in Das 1968. The document described local legends about entities the Montagnard people called Ring Len, which the translator had rendered as Great Forest People, territorial beings that stood between 2 and 3 meters tall, covered in dark hair ranging from brown to black, who had inhabited the deepest parts of the valley for as long as tribal memory extended, predating even the oldest Montagnard settlements by countless generations. According to the interviews, these beings were not spirits or demons, but physical creatures of flesh and blood, highly intelligent and capable of complex behavior, who maintained strict territorial boundaries, marked by twisted branches, and would violently defend those boundaries against any intrusion, though they typically avoided direct confrontation unless provoked or if they perceived a threat to their young or food sources. The document noted that Montagnard hunters who accidentally crossed into Ring Elen territory reported being studied by the creatures, followed through the jungle for hours or sometimes days by presences they could hear and smell but rarely see, and that those hunters who showed respect by immediately leaving the territory were allowed to depart unharmed, while those who continued deeper into the forbidden areas simply never returned their remains, occasionally discovered years later in remote caves, the bones carefully arranged in patterns that suggested ritual or ceremony rather than random scattering by scavengers. What made Kowalski's blood run cold was the final paragraph, a handwritten note added by the Special Forces captain who had compiled the interviews. Multiple indigenous sources confirm increased Ring Elen activity in sectors adjacent to FSB. Ripcord between March-July 1970. Montagnard scouts refused to operate in these areas. Recommend alternate patrol routes. Request denied by division. NVA activity takes precedence over indigenous superstition. They had been stationary for approximately 20 minutes, analyzing the documents and debating their next tactical move, when Russo suddenly raised his hand in the silent signal for enemy movement and pointed to their 11 o'clock position, roughly 30 meters distant through the dense undergrowth. Every man in the team immediately acquired that target area, safeties clicking off with practiced silence, and for perhaps 10 seconds they saw nothing but the natural patterns of jungle vegetation, shadows and light playing through the canopy, until the shadows themselves seemed to shift in a way that defied the static afternoon sun, and what they had perceived as an oddly shaped tree trunk, approximately 50 meters away, revealed itself to be something else entirely as it moved laterally with fluid, purposeful motion. The figure stood at least 2.5 meters tall, massively built through the shoulders and chest, covered in dark brown hair that appeared almost black in the filtered light, and it was carrying something over one shoulder, something that wore jungle boots and had one arm hanging limp. And Kowalski realized with horror that he was looking at Bear Thompson's unconscious or dead body being transported through the jungle like a deer carcass by something that moved with such confidence and power that vegetation simply parted around it rather than slowing its progress. Russo, acting on training and instinct, acquired a sight picture and began applying pressure to his trigger, but before he could fire, two more figures materialized from the jungle to the creature's left and right, moving in what was clearly a coordinated flanking pattern, the kind of tactical movement that required communication and planning. And the team suddenly understood with crystalline clarity that they weren't dealing with a single animal or even a group of uncoordinated creatures. They were facing something that understood military tactics and was implementing them with precision. Williams made the command decision to fire an M18 colored smoke grenade rather than initiate direct contact, the red smoke billowing up through the canopy in the universal signal for emergency extraction needed, hoping that someone at Division might have an aircraft in the area that could respond. But the moment the smoke began rising, all three figures simply vanished into the jungle with impossible speed, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move through terrain that dense, and the forest fell silent again, except for the hissing of the smoke grenade and the hammering of 6 hearts that understood they had just been outmaneuvered by an enemy that operated by rules they did not understand. The red smoke had barely begun to dissipate when Williams's radio crackled back to life with a transmission so clear it seemed impossible given the interference they had experienced just minutes before. And the voice that came through wasn't from their firebase or any American frequency they recognized, but rather a series of vocalizations that sounded disturbingly close to human speech, deep guttural sounds that rose and fell with the cadence of conversation, as if something had learned to use their own communications equipment against them, or was somehow mimicking the patterns of radio transmission. Kowalski ordered Williams to kill the radio immediately, but the moment the power switch was toggled to off, they heard the same vocalizations coming from the jungle around them, not from one direction, but from at least 5 different positions, forming a rough circle with their team at the center. And the calls were being answered and repeated in a pattern that anyone with military experience would recognize as a communication network, units reporting positions and coordinating movement. The temperature continued to drop precipitously, their breath now visible in the air, despite the fact that it was mid-afternoon in a tropical climate where temperatures should never fall below 20 degrees Celsius. And Doc Martinez noticed that the vegetation immediately around their position was beginning to show signs of frost, impossible crystalline formations appearing on leaf surfaces and spider webs, as if winter itself had somehow manifested in this single 20-meter circle of jungle. Chon was the first to notice the eyes, dozens of them at varying heights, ranging from 2 to 3 meters above ground level, reflecting the dim afternoon light with that distinctive eye shine you see in nocturnal animals. Except these eyes weren't the small pinpoints of rodents, or the slightly larger reflections of monkeys. These were massive oval shapes easily 6 to 8 centimeters across, and they weren't moving erratically, like startled animals. They were stationary and focused, observing the Marines with an intensity that suggested analysis rather than simple awareness. The jungle canopy above them began to shake despite the absence of wind-massive branches that would require hydraulic equipment to move swaying back and forth, as if something incredibly heavy was moving through the upper story of the forest. And the Marines realized with mounting horror that they weren't just surrounded on ground level. There were entities above them as well, occupying all three dimensions of the battle space in a manner that no conventional military force could achieve without extensive specialized training. Russo, the youngest member of the team, who had maintained his composure through firefights that had broken veteran soldiers, began hyperventilating despite his training, his rifle barrel wavering as he tried to acquire targets that seemed to phase in and out of his ability. Between the trees there, one moment and gone the next, as if they understood exactly where each Marine was looking and positioned themselves, just beyond the focal point of human vision. William started praying under his breath in Spanish, a string of Hail Marys that his grandmother had taught him as a child, words he hadn't spoken since basic training, but that now came pouring out in a desperate stream while his hands mechanically checked his ammunition count. Over and over, 28 rounds, 27, 28, as if the numbers themselves kept changing, and he couldn't trust his own memory. Martinez pulled out his Kabar fighting knife and held it in his left hand while keeping his rifle in his right. Some primal part of his brain, recognizing that whatever was out there was close enough that they might need to fight hand to hand, and the blade trembled slightly in his grip, despite 2 tours of combat that had taught him to control his fear response. Chun began muttering tactical observations in a monotone voice, reporting what he was seeing as if he was still conducting a normal reconnaissance patrol. Multiple contacts, 2 o'clock, 3 meters elevation, range approximately 40 meters, moving left to right, count now 4, correction 5, they're communicating. Pattern suggests coordinated movement. We are surrounded, we are surrounded, we are surrounded. The last phrase repeating like a broken record until Kowalski grabbed his shoulder and physically shook him back to some semblance of awareness. The entities began producing sounds that fell somewhere between primate vocalizations and human speech. Complex patterns of grunts, clicks, and what could almost be described as words in a language that had never been spoken by human vocal cords. And the sounds were coming from all directions simultaneously now, creating an acoustic environment so disorienting that the Marines could no longer accurately determine distance or direction. Every sound seeming to come from everywhere at once, as if the jungle itself had become a living thing that was communicating with parts of itself. Their watches, which had stopped earlier, suddenly began running again, but at different speeds. Chun's racing forward, while Russo's ticked backward. Martinez is spinning wildly. Through hours and seconds, the passage of time itself becoming unreliable, as if the fundamental rules that governed reality had different values in this particular location. Kowalski made the tactical decision that had kept him alive through 2 tours. They needed to break contact immediately and move toward any form of extraction point, even if it meant abandoning tactical stealth and running full speed through hostile territory, because staying in this position meant death or worse, and he gave the order to move in a staggered column back toward their insertion point 8 clicks to the northeast. They had covered perhaps 50 meters, moving as fast as the terrain would allow while maintaining any semblance of tactical awareness, when the jungle ahead of them suddenly erupted with movement, not the random thrashing of panicked animals, but coordinated motion, as at least 7 massive figures stepped out from behind trees and vegetation to block their path, forming a living wall that made continued movement impossible without direct engagement. The Marines spun to retreat back the way they had come, only to find their rear exit similarly blocked by another group of entities. And when they checked their flanks, they discovered the same situation. They were completely enclosed in a box formation that any infantry officer would recognize as a textbook ambush position, the kind of tactical maneuver that required planning, communication, and an understanding of human behavior patterns. The entities began closing the distance, moving with coordinated precision, reducing the perimeter around the Marines from 50 meters to 40 to 30, the circle tightening like a noose. And what was most terrifying wasn't the prospect of violence, but the absolute control these creatures demonstrated. The way they moved in perfect synchronization, without any visible signals, as if they were connected by some form of communication the Marines couldn't perceive. Williams attempted one final radio transmission, keying the mic and simply saying, broken arrow, grid 674,382, 6 personnel, contact with unknown hostile force, request immediate air support, any station this net, using the emergency code that meant American forces were being overrun and would be dead within minutes without intervention. But his transmission was immediately answered, not by division or any American unit, but by one of the entities, a deep voice that came through his handset, speaking what sounded like a perfect mimicry of his own words. Broken arrow, repeated back to them in a tone that could have been mockery or curiosity or something else entirely. The circle had tightened to 20 meters now, close enough that the Marines could see individual features' faces that were, simultaneously, familiar and alien eyes that reflected intelligence, and assessment massive hands that could clearly crush a human skull with minimal effort, and every rifle in the team was aimed at a different target. But Kowalski had not given the order to fire because some part of him understood that the moment they initiated violence, they would all die, and he was desperately searching for any alternative that might keep his men alive for even a few more minutes while the entities continued their inexorable advance, 15 meters now, close enough to smell that overwhelming musk that seemed to bypass rational thought and trigger pure fear in the most primitive parts of the human brain. And in that moment, Kowalski understood with absolute clarity that they were about to be captured or killed by something that military training had never prepared them to face. Something that operated by rules that had nothing to do with the Geneva Convention, or the laws of warfare, or any human concept of combat. The sound that saved their lives came from above, the distinctive whop-whop of rotor blades cutting through humid air, and Williams's broken arrow call had apparently reached someone because a pair of H-1G Cobra gunships appeared over the canopy at treetop level, their door gunners visible in the open cockpits, scanning for targets below. And the moment those helicopters became audible, every single entity surrounding the Marines simply stopped advancing, frozen in position as if someone had pressed pause on a film projector. The creatures' heads tilted upward in unison, tracking the aircraft with obvious awareness and what appeared to be calculation rather than animal fear. And for perhaps 5 seconds, the standoff held. 6 terrified Marines caught between massive bipedal creatures on the ground and salvation in the form of rotary wing aircraft above, until the lead Cobra pilot came across the radio with Groundhog 6. We have your position, marking multiple large heat signatures surrounding your location. Request authorization for gun run. Kowalski, his voice remarkably steady considering the circumstances, responded, negative, hold fire, contacts are withdrawing. Because even as he spoke, the entities were indeed pulling back, not fleeing in panic, but executing what any military observer would recognize as a tactical withdrawal, moving backwards, while maintaining visual contact with the Marines, retreating in coordinated fashion into the densest parts of the jungle where aerial observation would be impossible. Within 30 seconds, the creatures had completely vanished, leaving behind only disturbed vegetation and those impossibly large footprints pressed deep into the jungle floor. And the oppressive cold that had surrounded the Marines dissipated almost instantly, temperature returning to normal tropical levels so quickly that their fatigues went from frost-covered to sweat-soaked within minutes. The Cobras maintained their orbit overhead while a Huey medevac dropped into a nearby clearing. And as the Marines moved toward the extraction point, Sean noticed something that would haunt him for years. One of the entities, larger than the others, stood partially visible at the tree line, approximately 100 meters distant, and it was holding something cradling it almost gently against its chest, and through his rifle scope, Chun could see jungle boots and camouflage fabric, and he realized with sick certainty that he was looking at Bear Thompson's body being carried away into the jungle, not as a trophy or food source, but with something that resembled care, and the creature maintained eye contact with Chun for several seconds before, turning and disappearing into the forest with its burden, moving with such fluid grace that vegetation barely rustled in its wake. The Huey had barely touched down at LZ Stud before the team found themselves surrounded not by medical personnel or their chain of command, but by 3 men in civilian clothes who identified themselves as representatives from Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Intelligence, MACV-SOG, though their credentials seemed deliberately vague, and none of them provided actual names beyond single-letter designations. The lead agent, who insisted they call him Mr. C, conducted individual interviews with each Marine in separate areas of the Yao Firebase, and his questions had nothing to do with enemy troop movements or NVA positions, and everything to do with the specific details of what they had encountered: exact heights, weight estimates, behavioral patterns, vocalizations, the twisted branch formations, the electromagnetic interference, every detail that made the encounter something other than conventional enemy contact. Within 6 hours of their extraction, the entire team received orders transferring them to different units scattered across 3 different military regions: Kowalski to Okinawa, Martinez to the Philippines, Chun to a training command in California, Williams to Germany, and Russo to a psychiatric evaluation facility in Hawaii, each transfer categorized as immediate administrative necessity with priority codes that superseded normal personnel movement procedures. Before they were separated, Mr. C gathered them one final time in a sealed briefing room, where he explained in language that left no room for misinterpretation that their after-action reports would reflect contact with an unknown enemy force, possibly NVA Special Operations troops, that Lance Corporal Thompson was listed as missing in action, with status to be updated to killed in action after appropriate time elapsed, and that any deviation from the official narrative would result in courts-martial proceedings for violations of national security, protocols they didn't even know existed. Doc Martinez, the only one brave enough or foolish enough to ask, said, "What about Thompson's family? What about the truth?" And Mr. C responded with words that Martinez would remember verbatim for the rest of his life. "The truth is that your friend disappeared during a classified operation in a combat zone, which is accurate, and his family will receive the benefits and honors they deserve, which is appropriate, and what you think you saw in that jungle stays in that jungle, because some truths are more dangerous than any enemy we're officially fighting." The team was issued new military records that made no mention of their patrol on October 23, 1971. Their personnel files scrubbed of any reference to force recon operations in the A Shau Valley during that period, and each man was required to sign documents classified at levels they had never heard of, documents that essentially made them ghosts of the American military machine, still in service, but officially erased from the operational history of the war. The official Marine Corps casualty report filed on November 3, 1971, 11 days after the incident, listed Lance Corporal Michael Bear Thompson as killed in action during a reconnaissance patrol in Thea, Thean Province, body not recovered with the standard notation that remains were unrecoverable due to hostile action and terrain conditions, language that his family in Oregon would read without ever knowing what those carefully chosen words were designed to conceal. Staff Sergeant Vincent Kowalski served out the remaining 4 months of his tour from a desk at Camp Butler in Okinawa, processing supply requisitions and never once returning to field operations, before receiving an early honorable discharge in February 1972 with a service record that made no mention of Force Recon or the A Shau Valley, and he returned to his hometown of Chicago, where he worked as a machinist for 32 years, without ever speaking about what he witnessed. In that jungle, not to his wife, not to his children, not even to other Vietnam veterans who would have understood. Corporal James Doc Martinez was reassigned to a medical battalion in the Philippines, where he spent 6 months treating routine illnesses and minor injuries. Work so mundane compared to his previous assignment that he requested psychiatric evaluation himself, leading to a diagnosis of adjustment disorder with mixed anxiety and depressed mood that resulted in his medical retirement from the Corps in August 1972, and he eventually completed his medical degree at UCLA, becoming an emergency room physician who specialized in trauma care, but who would wake up screaming from nightmares about eyes watching from the jungle until he died of a heart attack in 1994 at age 46. Lance Corporal Robert Shun was sent to Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, where he instructed new lieutenants in land navigation and reconnaissance tactics. Though his students noticed that he refused to conduct any training exercises in densely forested areas, preferring open terrain, where visibility extended for hundreds of meters in all directions, and he left the service in 1973 to become a civil engineer in San Francisco, designing bridges and buildings that existed in the ordered, rational world of mathematics and physics, where the rules never changed and nothing impossible ever happened. Private First Class Deshaun Williams received transfer orders to a communications unit in Stuttgart, Germany, as far from Southeast Asian jungles as the Marine Corps could send him, where he maintained radio equipment for NATO forces and never once volunteered for field exercises. And his service record from that period notes multiple instances of refusing to work with PRC-77 radios, specifically the same model, that had transmitted those impossible vocalizations back to him, leading to a general discharge under honorable conditions in 1973 for inability to adapt to military requirements. And he returned to Mississippi, where he worked as a postal carrier, and told everyone who asked that he had spent his entire tour in Germany and had never seen combat. Lance Corporal Anthony Russo spent 14 months at the Naval Hospital in Pearl Harbor, undergoing psychiatric treatment for what doctors diagnosed as acute stress, reaction with dissociative features, military language for someone who had seen something that broke him in ways that no amount of therapy could fully repair, and his medical records from that period, partially declassified in 1998, describe persistent nightmares about being studied by something that understood tactics better than his instructors at SOI, and recurring episodes where he would stop mid-sentence and whisper, "They're watching, they're always watching," though he could never explain who they were. And he was medically retired from the Corps in 1973 with a disability rating for psychiatric conditions, returning to his parents' home in New Jersey, where he lived in their basement until his death by suicide in 1989, leaving no note and no explanation beyond a single word written on the wall above where his body was found. Sorry. The twisted branch formations that Force Recon teams continued to encounter throughout the A Shau Valley for the remaining years of American involvement in Vietnam were officially documented in intelligence reports as enemy trail markers or VC territorial indicators, convenient explanations that allowed military planners to acknowledge the phenomena without addressing what they actually represented. And those reports were quietly archived in classified vaults at Fort Bragg and the Pentagon, where they remain sealed under national security protocols that specify review dates extending into the 2040s. Thompson's family received his Purple Heart and Bronze Star in a ceremony at camp. Pendleton in 1972 medals pinned to a uniform draped over an empty coffin because there was no body to bury. And his mother spent the rest of her life writing letters to congressmen and senators, demanding to know why her son's remains were never recovered. Letters that received polite responses about the difficulties of body recovery in dense jungle terrain, but never the truth about what actually carried her son into the forest. The 5 surviving members of that patrol received non-disclosure agreements that they were required to renew every 5 years. Documents that reminded them, in unambiguous legal language, that discussing their experiences with anyone outside authorized personnel channels would result in federal prosecution under espionage statutes, and those agreements remained in force. Even after the war ended, even after files were declassified, even after Freedom of Information Act requests began revealing other classified operations, because some secrets are deemed too destabilizing to acknowledge, regardless of how much time passes. In 1995, a researcher working through newly declassified MACVSOG documents discovered a single-page memorandum dated December 1971 stamped "Top Secret Eyes Only" that referenced biological anomalies in Io Alpha, military parlance for the A Shau Valley, and recommended continued monitoring and non-engagement protocols for unidentified large primate contacts. Language that was simultaneously specific enough to acknowledge something existed and vague enough to maintain plausible deniability. But attempts to locate additional documentation referenced in that memo revealed that entire filing cabinets worth of reports had been lost during archive reorganization in 1975, coincidentally the same year American forces withdrew from Vietnam. The Nam Tad Nard scouts, who worked with special forces throughout the war, returned to their villages and continued to mark territorial boundaries they would not cross, boundaries that shifted and changed over time as the Gi Ring Len moved through their ancient ranges, and when researchers in the 1980s and 1990s tried to interview tribal elders about these beings, they received the same response that French Foreign Legion troops had received decades earlier. Some territories belong to others. Some boundaries are not meant to be crossed, and some truths are understood better through respect than through investigation. Vincent Kowalski died in 2003 without ever breaking his silence, but among his personal effects, his daughter found a topographical map of Thian province dated 1971, and written in the margins in her father's handwriting were coordinates that corresponded to no officially documented military operations, and next to those coordinates a single sentence: "They let us go." Why? Robert Chand is still alive today, age 73, living in a 10th floor apartment in San Francisco where every window faces open water and not a single tree blocks his view. And on the anniversary of October 23rd, each year, he drinks exactly 7 shots of whiskey, one for each member of his team, including the one they left behind, and stares at the Pacific Ocean until dawn, while wondering if somewhere in the mountains of Vietnam, in the few remaining stretches of jungle that survived Agent Orange and American bombs and the inevitable march of development, something massive and intelligent still walks upright through the forest, still arranges branches and territorial markers, still carries the wounded to caves where they either recover or their bones are carefully arranged according to some purpose human observers will never understand. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've ever been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.